Hi, everybody. All right, Flame Over Terra, Chapter 9. Once again, it was the timid Cessnan who took action, while all the others stood by in astonished silence, looking at the frightened boy. "We must cross the water," he cried. "This cannot be talked out at the top of our lungs with a stream between us." Before the bewildered Cayenne had gathered himself to think what was proper to do in this strange situation, Cessna had skipped nimbly past him and his banners and his squires and his wand of peace. A little farther along the bank, he scrambled down the slope to where a row of big stones gave foothold above the sparkling water. Gathering what position he could, Cayenne stalked after him and crossed the stream with his following to the opposite bank, where the small boy tried to hide his face against his father's tunic. Firmly, Cessna stood him away. "Tell them everything, my son," he said. "You have treated no one fairly." "I tried," cried Bennett, "to treat everyone fairly. I couldn't stop her from going. She wouldn't listen to me. But how could I tell about her and have her stopped? Was I not going to follow Patrick? Had she not the right to follow him just as I?" Unhappily, he poured out the whole story of how Macha had told him she would go, standing small and defensive in the ring of tall men who watched him with dark and furious faces, realizing that they had gathered to do battle over nothing. "Had she not the right," he demanded again at the end, "to follow Patrick just as I did?" "No," said the priest firmly, before anybody else could answer. "No. You had your father's consent. She is too young. How can she learn to follow God if she cannot follow firmly the rules of her father's house?" Laban looked at him sharply, and the priest looked quietly back. "I would not snatch your child from you, my friend, even for my God." Bennett was given. His strong, handsome face creased a little, almost as if he were embarrassed. "There are many good women who follow me and gladly allow their daughters to become servants of Christ, and many pious women of their own accord who make me gifts and lay their ornaments on my altar. But I give them back to them, and they are offended that I do so. But only thus can I be sure they follow me for God alone. I preserve myself cautiously that men will not say they follow me for myself." Although his voice was firm and clear, his eyes were diffident and anxious, creased with concern as to how he might appear in the eyes of men, and around him his listeners were silent, more held by his humble honesty than if he raved and shouted of his God. "But this girl," he went on, "must return to her father's house. There is time for her yet. Bennett, my son, where is she now?" Somehow, reproach had been overlooked, and Bennett blinked around in relief that he had got away so easily. "She is among the women, father," he answered at once eagerly, "in the barn. Go then, and bring her to us." Bennett forgot he was the follower of the priest, the chosen successor of Patrick. He could only understand that after so many miserable, secretive days, his conscience was clear again, and he could put everything right. On Patrick's word, he whipped around from the group of men and dashed off up the long green slope as fast as he could run, exciting the two wolfhounds with his sudden rush, so that they whined and barked and struggled on their long leash, dragging the squire who held them through the middle of the group. Cayenne staggered and was brought almost to the ground, leash and dogs twining around his legs, a tangle of barking and cursing and shouting, until Dichu's firm command brought them panting to his heels. Laban, in his happy moment, waiting for his child, almost laughed aloud to see the gorgeous Cayenne, on the business of his king, confused and routed by this muddle of barking dogs and running children. "If all goes well today," thought Laban happily, "he will soon learn that there is not much that cannot be brought down to nonsense by a house full of children." "Ah, poor Cayenne," he thought then, "it will not be easy. He has first to settle this business here to his own satisfaction, and what pleases him may not please the king." The dogs were quiet, and Bennett's small figure vanished into the dun, and in the quiet after the uproar, Cayenne was coming to the understanding of his position. Never in all his splendid days as avenger to the king had he felt so small and useless. He was reared in military school and on the battlefield, to the pomp and ceremony of challenge and counter-challenge, parley and battle, and the death or glory of a single combat. Here he had mustered an army and marched them for days to deal with a prank that lay between a couple of children. Nor could he see any guilt in this quiet man before him, with the gold gleaming on his forehead, nor in the enormous warrior beside him, speaking easily to his panting dogs, who rolled red, loving tongues about his hands. Cayenne felt as if he were trying to offer battle to the sparkling cobwebs that were drying in the sunshine on the winds. Desperately he strove to remember that the king considered that this priest of Rome was dangerous, and no matter what the excuse had been, it was to kill him that he had been sent. Patrick looked at him as if he read the heart of his mind, and above the brown beard his eyes were touched with amusement. "My poor friend," he said, and Cayenne flinched at the understanding in his voice. "There is nothing here for a champion, is there? There's nothing here to fight." He turned to Labrin. "You," he said, her father, "I beg you forgive me, but I knew none of this." Cayenne had not yet found words to answer this quiet man, to restore his dignity and assert himself as the king's champion. He struggled to find the ferocity that would make further words unnecessary, that would allow him to lift the answerer here and now and kill this man without more talk, as he had been instructed. That would please his king and give his restless warriors all the battle they required. But when he looked into the mild, amiable face and met the direct, uncomplicated eyes, his sword hand stayed quiet at his side, and he admitted to himself in amazement and dismay that he could not find the mind to do it. But Macha touched him more closely than the king. "There is plenty here for me to fight on," he shouted suddenly, and now his hand dropped to his sword, appalled at the thought that he had come so near to losing her. "She is my betrothed!" "Ah!" Now Patrick smiled openly. It was not all then for the king. "Why do you wait?" Cayenne could no longer control his impatience and whispered urgently behind the champion. "Why do you wait? They have the girl here. That is enough. Kill first the Roman as the king wills." Cayenne listened to the hoarse, fierce whisper, and again he looked at the other group and knew what he should do. It did not need Cayenne to prompt him, but against the smiling face of the priest and the tranquil indifference of Dichu fondling his great dogs, he knew he could not do it. There was nothing here for battle. The reckoning with Leary might well cost him his head, but he could not bring himself to this act. He drew a hand across his brow and refused to look at the angry face of Cayenne and Tenna at his shoulder. He knew that this moment of decision, even if it did not cost his life, must cost him his position as champion of the king. Of what use was an avenger who could no longer kill on order? But he could not do it. He was utterly bewildered, severed suddenly from all the thoughtless, bloody rules that up till now had been the order of his life. Beneath him, his legs felt weak and foolish, as though some great wound had drained away his blood, and in the hot sun he could feel the sweat beading around the edges of his hair. He eased his sticky palm in the leather grip of his shield and turned away from the exasperated Cayenne, breathing deeply to clear his muddled head. Looking upward suddenly to the top of the hill, he saw Macha coming slowly down, hand in hand with Bennett. He had had a great deal of trouble in getting her. The growing band of women who followed in the way of Patrick had made their living place in the loft of the great barn, which Dichu had given to the Christians for a church. Once safely arrived at the den of Dichu, Macha had abandoned her disguise and taken her place among the women, telling those few who recognized her that she had been allowed to come, and raising astonished eyebrows when they said they had not noticed her on the journey. For the first few days she was ecstatically happy. She understood very little of all she heard, but she was willing to believe, and it was enough for her to be within reach of Patrick and within the daily sound of his voice. She felt the time coming close when she would have the courage to go to the priest and ask to be baptized a Christian in the well of Dichu, accepting all she had been taught. She was only afraid that, seeing how young she was, he might ask her of his parents, and to him she could not lie. So she kept always in the crowd and watched him from a distance. But after a little while, loneliness and homesickness took her like a fever, so that she could no longer hear or listen to anything that was said, drowned in the longing that held her for Seshnan and the family and all the small, happy things of her childhood, for the cool green summer sea and the sliding sand under her feet, the lark shrilling up at morning from the fields below the Cayenne, where she was half awake, and the warm red fire glowing in the hall against the winter mists. Her heart ached for her foster sisters and their parents, and for Bennett. Bennett was the greatest misery of all, for she saw him every day, the chosen of Patrick, walking in the footsteps of his master, wherever he might go, and sitting at his feet. Bennett, always in her sight, while she was under the strict eyes of the older women, was as far from her as the blue, unattainable, pointed peaks of the distant hills. She was sick with misery and grief, and the name of God and the word of God fell into her mind as hollow as the note of Patrick's bell, and no longer had the smallest meaning. On the misty evening when the news was brought that a vast army of strange warriors was approaching the dun, she was alarmed but obedient, and it did not occur to her for one moment that it had anything to do with her. All those who had followed Patrick and built dwellings on the land below the dun were told to gather into the heart of the fort itself and spend the night in silence and darkness, so that in the gathering fog the enemy could not know in which direction to attack. In this way, action could be held off until the morning, when Dichu and Patrick could go down and speak with these men themselves and find out why they came. In the bright, dust-laden shafts of sun that pierced the rough timbers of the barn, Macha worked the next morning with her broom, doing her share of the day's tasks, and waited apprehensively, like everyone else, for news of the army below the hill, listening to one of the women who had climbed to the roof beams of the barn and clung there among the startled pigeons, peering down over the walls of the rath at the small, distant figures who talked across the stream. Faithfully, she recounted their every move. "There is one of them coming back," she called down at last. "Running! He has startled the dogs, and there is tumult at the stream. It is the boy Bennett. He is running as fast as he can run, back up into the dun." The women on the beam clutched and craned to try and see closer down beneath her, where Bennett had vanished from her sight. By Jichu's order, they were forbidden to open their doors or shutters until they had been told that it was safe to do so. "He is out of sight." Reluctantly, the watcher turned back to the small group, still standing by the stream in the soft brilliance of the sun, but there was nothing she could find to say about them. "They are just standing," she said with disappointment. "But no, I cannot see, but I can hear. Quiet," she called. "There is someone running along below our wall." In the sudden silence, all the women looked at each other, and fear grew in many of their faces. Outside, there was the thump of more feet running, and voices that called out, and the quick answering tremble of a child. Macha's fingers tightened on the rough handle of her broom, and her ears grew taut to listen to the padding of the first light pair of feet on the beaten earth around the barn. They stopped only as two fists began to pummel on the great shuttered doors, and clearly Bennett's voice cried hoarsely for Macha. "Macha! The master says I must have Macha. It is the order of Patrick." There were other footsteps then that caught up with him, and urgent grown-up voices who argued with the child. Inside, the round eyes of all the women turned on Macha through the sun-striped shadows, and she looked back at them a little frightened, understanding nothing any more than they did themselves. "I do not know," she whispered in answer to their unspoken question. "I do not know." The old woman who was in charge of them all frowned portentously and waddled to the door, trailing straw under the hem of her long skirts, and with hens scuttered from her path. "What is it, child?" she called through a knothole in the wood, torn between her respect for the boy who was the chosen of Patrick and the desire to assert her own authority. Heavily and anxiously she bent and pressed her great bulk against the door, peering through the hole to look straight and startled into the blue eyes of the boy, who peered from the other side. Bennett blinked and drew back. "I must have Macha, good mother," he cried again. "Patrick, our father, bade me bring him Macha down here by the stream." "And the chief bade me not to open this door," rumbled the old one, knowing that in the end she must give in, but holding to her shreds of dignity by putting off as long as possible the moment of doing so. "I don't think it matters now about the door," Bennett cried. "If you give Macha, then these warriors will go, I think. Her father waits for her at the stream too," he added, "and my father." "My father!" Inside, Macha dropped her broom and moved toward the door, having her first clear thought as to what all this might be about. "But why the mass of warriors? My father? Has he come to take me home?" she asked the old woman as she reached the door, and did not in truth know how she would feel if he had. She was bemused, knowing that she should cry out here, and now that she would never go home with her father, but would follow Patrick as she had planned and promised, and follow his God for the rest of her life. But the loneliness and misery of the last days were like a cloud over her mind and will, and she could bring herself to say nothing. The narrow, rheumy eyes of the old mother in charge peered at her knowingly from the folds of her fleshly face. An even heave of her bronchitic breath sounded like a reproach. She turned her own eyes away. "I can but speak with my father," she said weakly, and even as she said it, she felt that she was betraying both herself and Patrick and his God, and all the things she had come to believe in since that first evening in the den of Cessnan. "I can but speak with him." Now she almost shouted defensively, and hearing her voice, Bennett cried out again outside the door, "Macha, it's urgent that you come." "You can but speak with him," agreed the old woman sadly, and she moved to lift the wooden bars of the small door set into the big one. "You can but speak with him. May God go with you, child." Macha acknowledged the farewell, but could not look at her, fiercely denying the finality of it, even to herself. "I will only speak with him and then come back," she told herself firmly as she bent to the small door. But when she passed through it, out into the sun, and felt Bennett's hard, warm hand reach out for hers again after all the lonely time, she felt absolutely silent. Bennett was too excited and preoccupied to notice her distress. He held her hand firmly in his tight, determined grip and led her steadily through the press of people who had rushed from all quarters of the den, chattering and speculating. But they fell back and allowed the boy unhindered to lead Macha all along the crest of the hill, and out through the great gates, and in and out through the ring of standing stones, that dwarfed their young figures and made strange patterns of shadows on the morning grass, and down the steep slope in the inn to where Cayenne stood at the bottom and watched her come. It was to the familiar arms of Cessnan that she flew first, forgetting all need for formality, her head on his breast and her face hidden while she struggled under the eyes of all these strangers to calm herself and collect her manners and her dignity. She moved over then to her father, who bent a fierce, uncompromising face to take her kisses on his cheeks. And then she turns to Dicho and to Cayenne with gestures of respect, her eyes widening for a startled moment at the strange intentness of the gaze of the fair young man. "My father," she began to speak, but her voice was small and lost in the green space, no louder than the larks that shrilled above the hill. Laban was before her. "My daughter," with no effort he shouted her down. "You see these warriors?" He waved a furious hand at the gathering on the plain. Macha turned and looked, but they meant nothing, her tawny eyes still dazed and empty. "You see them?" She nodded dumbly and looked at him, not understanding. "They are the warriors of the High King, and this," he moved to lay a hand on Cayenne's arm, "this is the King's avenger who leads them." For a long moment she stared up at the young giant above her, and Cayenne of the battlefields knew a strange new feeling more disturbing than any he had ever known to take him in the moments of bloodiest danger. "Leave her alone," he wanted to cry, looking at the white, puzzled face. "Leave her alone. Let the king carve me in quarters if he will, but not another word to her." He moved as if to throw Laban's hand from his arm, but the angry father was before him. "All of them here, my daughter, to avenge the fact that you were stolen by this priest of Rome and harbored by this Mandichu. Blood and vengeance to have let loose my foolish daughter." Understanding crept slowly into the tense, pale face, and she looked again down over the army of the plain and back at the tall, still figure of Cayenne bearing all his arms, with his squires behind him. "Oh, no," she whispered. Then more loudly, "No," she cried. "No! No one can fight over me for this. I was not taken. I came by my own accord." Behind her, Cessnan held out helpless hands, hearing the echo of his own futile voice. The spirit of her red hair was rising in Macha, and she wheeled on Bennett, with her white skirt swirling around her ankles. You knew that I came of my own accord. You knew all the time. Tell them." "I have told them." "Well?" Desperately, she swung about the ring of men who towered above her, but it was to Cayenne that in the end her eyes came back, screwed against the sun so that she might stare into his face, all formality forgotten. "Well?" she cried, and in her amazement she seized the edges of his blue shield and shook it, her pale face flushed now, and her eyes sparkling like the peat-brown waters of the little stream. "Well, what is there to fight about, my lord avenger? They have done me no harm, and at any time I could have left them. There is no cause for battle." Cayenne stirred as if he had been deep asleep and wrenched his eyes from her face. She loosed her hands from his shield and clasped them, waiting, and when he spoke at last, his voice was slow and heavy. "There is no cause for battle." Formally, he echoed her own words, and there was nothing to show that, if the king's mood were wrong, with these words he could have forfeited his life. Laban looked at him gratefully and moved a little closer. "It is a good decision," he said. "I will help you with the king." But Cayenne did not seem to hear him. Through all this, Patrick and Dichu had watched in silence, but after Cayenne had spoken, Macha turned toward the priest, and happiness was wiped from her face again by dark distress. "My father in God," she said, and all the fire had left her. Her voice was small and hopeless. "My father in God, how can I go home?" "How can you not, my child? It is your place. But I came to you. I came to follow you and your God, and I promised I would give him my life." "You promised who, my daughter?" asked Patrick gently. The girl covered her face with her hands, utterly unable to come to terms with this situation which had been thrust on her so suddenly and before so many people. She could not think clearly as to who she was betraying, but she was surely letting someone down to turn and run like this. Dumbly, she let her hands slide down her face and looked straight at the priest. "Who? I promised only myself, I think." Indeed, she did not understand enough yet of this new God to talk to him as many of the women did and make promises direct, nor had she promised anything to Patrick himself. "Yes," he said now, and his face was kind and quiet. "Yourself. And you are too young yet to make so big a promise. And now you will make one to me." Macha watched his face and waited, and she felt the turmoil in her own grow quiet under the calm, friendly smile. "Learn first, my daughter," he said, "to obey your father in all things. Then you will be more ready to learn how to obey God. We will talk of all that again at some better time." Her eyes widened. "I will see you again? Surely. I will be with you all again, and may God be with you until then." He lifted a hand in what Macha learned to call a blessing, and all the men watched him in a strange silence and did not move. And as he turned away up the hill, her father drew her aside to scold her for all the trouble she had caused, and to pet her in alternate breaths, exclaiming on how tall she had grown and how comely, then to lose his temper again and scold her some more. Dichu came over to Cayenne, and they spoke together amiably above the rough, thrusting heads of the dogs, and Dichu offered to Cayenne and his men the customary great feast to mark their agreement on peace. Cayenne thanked him with courteous words, but said his men would not make easy guests, being wild and ugly over losing their chance of a battle, and behind him Cathan showed that this was true, for his bright face was black as thunder, and his hand restless on the long hilt of his sword. The two warriors bade each other farewell with much respect, and Cayenne turned without another glance at Macha or her father to make his way back across the stream to his disappointed warriors. Laban and Sesnan came more slowly behind him, the girl between them. "And now," said Laban a little breathlessly as they climbed up the small bank of the stream, taking a handhold on clumps of yellow iris and hearing the first angry shouts that rose round Cayenne in the distance. "Now I am sure, my kinsman, that the next tale that will ring round the hearth fires of Aram will be about the day when the champion of the High King himself faced the priest of Rome in anger, and of how Patrick laid a spell on him as he stood there, so that he dropped his mighty sword and turned away without a fight." Sesnan stood still and looked at him. His clothes were still crumpled and awry from his sleepless night, but his thin face had taken back serenity, and his smile was the one that Macha had grown up with in the small, happy dun. "Well, yes, my kinsman," he answered, Laban amiably. Sorry, kiddos. "And was that not just what happened?" Laban snorted and strode on across the field. High on the hill of Dichu, Patrick waited with Bennett for the chieftain to come with them, leaning on his staff between the tall gray pillars of the standing stones, looking down across the sunlit fields to the tumult and the mass of roaring anger that was Cayenne's disappointed army. "Think you," said Dichu, and turned with him to match the milling warriors, "think you that young man can hold them without their battle? I am not sure that they will not attack in spite of him." His face was anxious, but Patrick merely looked at him in slight surprise. He gave his crozier to Bennett to hold for him and eased the gold band off his forehead, leaving a harsh red mark in front of his tonsured hair. "The young man?" he said almost absently, glancing down again toward the fields and rubbing his forehead. "Oh, yes, that young man will hold them." Even as they watched, they saw the fair head of Cayenne rising above his men, mounted in his chariot with his face toward Tara, and in a moment his white horses leaped into a gallop, and he was off, a vanishing patch of color on the green fields. Behind him his men, although slowly and reluctantly, grouped their captains to follow him, and before Patrick and Dichu turned into the great gates of the dun, they were beginning to stream off across the plain. Down in the fields of the camp, Macha drew back to watch Cayenne thunder by, his face set from the most difficult task he had ever undertaken, his fair hair lifting to the speed of his passing, and his blue cloak streaming out behind him in the wind. "Father," she said on a deep breath, when the wheels of his chariot had rattled into silence, "I know he is the avenger of the king, but what is his name?" Her father looked down at her, prepared to forgive her everything, now that he had got her back. "His name is Cayenne," she said, "Cayenne of the bright axe, champion of the collar." He gazed at her with love and pride, delighted to see that in her own fragile, red-haired beauty, she had grown up, well matched for Cayenne. "I will tell you now, my little daughter, that it is to him that we have promised you in marriage. And do not fear for him for this day's work. The king loves him. All will be well." He waited for her cries of pleasure and delight and gazed at her in astonished anger when she burst into a passion of tears. He could not see down into her secret heart where she still cherished the promise she had made, if only to herself, to give her life to Patrick and his God. Homesickness and loneliness had weakened her so that she had broken her promise, and now, as she struggled to remember that she had even made it, he offered her for a husband the most handsome and splendid young warrior she had ever seen. Sesnan patted her chestnut hair. "She is weary," he said kindly and absently. "She is weary." His own eyes were turned to the south, beyond the blue points of the mountains, and his mind was on the welcome that would await him at the gates of his dun.